Welcome, sir. जय भीम,
Yeah.
जय बिरसा, जय फुले, जय सावित्री, जय फातिमा, जय मंडल, क्रांतिवीर सलाम, फुल जोहार, जय संविधान. Today we have distinguished scholar Dr. Soumick. He is currently postdoctoral fellow at Indian Council of Social Sciences Research, New Delhi. His book Preservation, Pedagogy, and the Comic, a survey of the concept of theater in the Christian Middle Ages, come out this year from Akar Publisher, India. Welcome, sir. Please
Welcome.
enlighten us.
Thank you, Pradhani, and it is a great pleasure to be here. And I would, it's an extremely generous offer made by the Bapsa CUG for me to speak here. So I am hardly competent to speak in some of the political issues which are brought up by Bapsa, and the question of caste and the question of the basically not simply the question of caste but the scholarship of Ambedkar. This is something which is I am slowly learning, which is something I learned from my friends, but this is not something which I am very competent to speak right now. So I will speak on something which is a bit different, which is on the problem of wealth. But before I go into the lecture, so I'll take say around 30-40 minutes. Okay, then we can have a set of questions, discussions. Uh, yeah. Firstly, thank you so much for calling me, for inviting me here. It's a great pleasure. Um, so, uh, so let me just begin with the title of the talk, which is called "Your Money and Your Life." It is it, it is derived from a certain book that I will try to discuss. The main content of this lecture has to come from uh, a contemporary crisis, a kind of a very timely problem, but at the same time a very untimely problem, which is the problem of poverty, the question of the lack or the absence of money, in absence of wealth in that sense. So, but because this program was delayed, and the program we were when they had approached me, I was thinking of talking on the question of poverty, which I have been interested in for a long time. But then I realized that if we have to address the problem of poverty today as a contemporary problem, the nature of the problem has changed a lot. Even it is a continuously changing problem. So if you have to understand, if I have to understand the concept of poverty today, you cannot bypass the problem of wealth, the kind of culture of wealth, the culture of wealth in the sense, the kind of expressions, representations, and the ethical practices that are all related to wealth today. So I'll talk about that rather than go into which I'm not very competent also about, which I'm not very competent to do, which is to talk about the economic conditions of wealth, or the economic, which I don't agree also, this kind of a relationship of deterministic relationship between, superstructure structure type relationship, that that wealth has to be understood primarily from the economic point of view. I don't exactly agree, but that is another problem. But the culture of wealth, yeah, the ethics of wealth, the how, what is our relationship to wealth today, a kind of a subjective, cultural, artistic, which is in it, which is expressed in various forms. So that is basically the idea of today's lecture. It is to talk about the culture of wealth. But in order to do uh, a kind of an analysis of what is the problem of wealth today, the key word I think is problem. How to understand wealth is a problem, because everybody is engaged in a kind of such an intimate relationship with wealth, the accumulation of wealth, uh, the, mm, the representation of wealth, that one cannot almost, it is almost impossible for one to take a step back and think about the very nature of that accumulation, the very nature of that representation of wealth. So that is the basis of any problem. The problem is basically to take a step back. Problem is basically to take a step back and start thinking. So all thoughts are in that sense. All thoughts begin with identifying problems. All thoughts are in that sense. The mode of thinking is problematization. The mode of thinking is to problematize. So what is the problem of wealth today? That is the point. So let me just, so what I'll do is I have written a text which is a longest text, so I'll not read the entire text. That would be too boring and not possible in 30 minutes. But what I'll do is I'll try to read certain parts of the text and try to explain, at least reach our at least convey the basic uh, theme of what we are trying to, the basic, the basic point of what we are trying to say here. Uh, and in order to do so, we have to do a kind of a, it's not simply a question of describing what wealth is today, what is the nature of representation of wealth, but not just to describe, but in order for you to analyze something, you need a kind of a historical perspective, a kind of a genealogical study. So if you want to, it's a basic relationship, if you want to dig deeper, if you want to dig deeper into the question of wealth today, the culture of wealth, and digging deeper, say, is understood by as something like archaeology. So a kind of an archaeology of wealth today instantaneously demands you go back and and you examine the history of wealth, or how the nature of how wealth has been conceptualized, how wealth has been understood in the history of thinking, in the history of thought. So archaeology and genealogy, as you know, always goes together. So these are only terms, but you understand the basic uh, basic tendency of the methodology of this kind of an analysis. But why is it that in order to talk about the problem of wealth today, what I'll suddenly go back and talk about the nature of the problem of wealth at a very remote point in Western history, which is the history, um, Western history, which is during the medieval times, during the during the time of the heyday of Christianity, 13th century. So why do we have to know the nature of how wealth was understood in the 13th century, for example? That is necessary because of this problematic, because of this methodological gesture of understanding a problem, which is both to dig deeper into our own problems, we have to dig further into the history of that problem. So a kind of a history of the problem of wealth. That is the basis of this lecture. History of the problem of wealth. Okay. So this is as a kind of a preliminary note on methodology. All of this lecture has to be very, no, very fragmented, because it is not humanly possible to talk about all the things that we would like to talk about in half an hour. So I'll just point out certain pointers in that sense. Okay. So let me just read out the beginning section, and then we can examine that a bit. So the title is Your Money and Your Life, some remarks on political melancholy. So let me begin with something which is quite obvious to our perception these days. While we are stuck at home, mindlessly surfing the net, we hardly fail to see the almost pornographic, indecent display of wealth of the celebrities. The birthday parties of film stars, the dinner dates of sports celebs, the holidays in Maldives. There is an overflow of these images of wealth, of affluence, of money, and everything that money can buy. But then there is another kind of display, which is fueled by a growing ideology of social obligation of the elite, social obligation of the elite, which can't be summed up, which can be summed up by this, by this kind of a maxim, which is actually a popular maxim from drawn from a different cultural object. Uh, the maxim being, with great wealth comes great responsibility. No? So, this is from actually a superhero movie from Spider-Man. That with great power comes great responsibility. So something very similar is there in when you talk about the wealthy. With great wealth comes great responsibility. So we have this other kind of display of wealth, not apparently of accumulation, but of distribution. So we have images of celebrity charity, of the humanitarian emotions of the social elite towards the poor, which are valorized, while poverty itself becomes a glamorous practice of the upper classes. Think of all the, poverty as a glamorous practice. We know that from commonsensical examples, like, take a film like Slumdog Millionaire, but not just a film, certain everyday practices like which we unconsciously perform, which has its origin in poverty, which is the wearing of torn jeans, the wearing of faded jeans, wearing of worn clothes, which has become a fashion, which which is whose basis is the structure of such fashion is poverty, is a kind of a certain treatment of poverty, certain understanding of poverty. Anyway, so so this is a kind of a so we have so there is a kind of a spectacle of poverty in the sense of through the idea of charity, through the idea of kind of a humanitarian eradication of poverty has itself become a spectacle. So we have two types of spectacles. One is the spectacle of accumulation of wealth, and one is the spectacle of the distribution of wealth. But you see, so the paradigm becomes money. The paradigm becomes a kind of a of relationship to money, which is determined by a idea of spectacle. And this is a bit of a difficult problem for us to understand, but it is money today is no longer, and this is something which the Italian philosopher Giorgio Agamben has recently written a brilliant piece called Capitalism as Religion, where he has argued exactly this, that money is no longer a question of commodity, that money procures a commodity. The use value of commodity is more and more disappearing. Money is itself the commodity now. Money has become the very, the money has become completely self indicative or self reflective. That money doesn't buy anything but money. Money has closed its circle. Money has folded back onto itself, and this so money buys money. This is the basis of finance capital. This is the basis of when the gold standard is replaced by uh, in the 70s, early 70s, in during Nixon's period, when he talks about all of this. So I'm not going into the detail, but the point is that money is becoming more and more no a kind of not just spectacle, but the logic of spectacle is very important to understand. Here, the logic of spectacle is a kind of representation which doesn't, when money is represented, it is, money doesn't, money is not the means to an end. No, money is itself the end. Money is itself the mm, the means to its own end. This is the problem of spectacle. This is the problem of representation of money today. That that the problem of spectacle as a form of representation is that it represents nothing but itself. It represents, uh, if money is a form of mediation, or form of exchange, then what it exchanges is that you don't get a commodity in the end, but what it exchanges is itself. Matlab ki it basically perpetuates itself. Self perpetuation of money. This is the spectacle. This is the idea of kind of a continuous accumulation, not just of money. Now that you have more and more money because finally it will bring you happiness, but the very act of accumulation itself is identified as happiness. And at the same time, the other side of the coin is that you have a whole set of humanitarian causes which are coming up, which is that of celebrity charity, which is that of a certain responsibility towards society, which sociologically has been explained a lot, that it is the kind of insidious display of their own charity. The charity is a basic problem, no? Then that charity is a form of historically, I'm not going into it in details here, but charity is a form of self-dissolution. That charity is cannot be where the very act of distribution of wealth or any such thing can be underlined. That if I am giving alms to the poor, then it should not be about about me. It should be about the act. So the very idea of subject, who is giving alms, who is a generous person, this has to be erased. This has to be dissolved in the Christian idea of charity. So it would be always a problem if in the act of charity you pride yourself that yes, I am a charitable person. Then it is an assertion of the self in the very distribution of wealth. That cannot happen in the true act of charity. But today we see exactly this happening, that all forms of charity reverts back to the self. So charity has become more and more a narcissistic practice of the world. That it is that yes, I am responsible. Yes, I do my duty. Duty forms of so it is basically it follows the same logic of accumulation in some sense, which is that it is a question of the self or the subject which is constituted on the basis of a certain idea of positivity. And that positivity can be the logic of accumulation, that is more and more you know acquire or accumulate more, so more as positive as something which is present, or it can be a more ethical positivity, more moral positivity, that I'm doing something which is positive, which is so charity makes you this is also there, that if you have to be healthy you do charity, if you have to have a good mental health you distribute them, if you think positive do positive things. This is the part of, I'm not going into the details of it, that would take a separate kind of lecture, separate discussion. So but this is the problem, this kind of a hyper positivity which is informing both accumulation of wealth as also the distribution of wealth, because the wealth is taken as this positive category, which is the only category available, and it is not a question simply of survival. It is a question of it is not simply of survival, but it works at a much more insidious level, a kind of a totalizing gesture. Money is a totalizing reality. It's very similar to entertainment, which is also a question of entertainment. That is something. So money is something similar to entertainment, as also similar to passion. So money is the great passion. Money is the great entertainment. Entertainment and passion are not supposed to be similar things. This is something which is a very interesting topic, which if we have time in the end we will discuss. But how money is both entertainment and passion in today's world. But in order to understand this whole set of propositions, that money is entertainment and passion, money in the sense of accumulation and distribution, which are supposedly all of these oppositional categories have now collapsed, a kind of indiscernible in the question of money as a positive category. So, positive category is something that we will talk about. How is money becoming a positive category? This is the key problem. In a world where negativity cannot be tolerated. So if lack of money, that is poverty, is a lack of money now, in common sensical understanding. So the lack of money or poverty is immediately understood as an evil from an ethical perspective, but it is also something which has to be erased. It is also something which has to disappear. So we should not talk about poverty in itself unless we are talking about the eradication of poverty. You know, there is a great there is a very interesting writer who talks about how the question of poverty has become more and more this question of eradication. You cannot talk about poverty as such. So anyway, this is something we can talk about later. You know, so we have to then figure out a way of historically, understand how this money as a positive category emerges in history. What is the source of this money as a positive? What is the genealogy behind this? So we have to, in that sense, go back to a particular time when money was a problem. Money was taken as evil. Money was taken as a negative category within Christianity. So there is a French historian, great French historian, who wrote a book called Your Money or Your Life. Actually, the French title is very interesting, which is called La Bourse et la Vie. मतलब कि your purse and or your money and your life. Okay, this is a bit you know specific, but we can try to understand this little mistake that is made in the translation. That your money and your life, that was the title, the French title, which in English was translated as your money or your life. But this is not just a mistake. This is not just a mistake in the sense it was unconsciously made, perhaps. I don't know what is the background of the mistake. Translation ka mistake hua tha. But it is very interesting if we place this mistake of translation of this book vis-a-vis the content of the book. So as you can understand, your money and your life is a kind of positive logic because it's joined by and. So your money and your life is an accumulation. It's a question of two things coming together which are not contradictory. So both are in that sense not placed in oppositional form. Understand this? No? Your money and your life is not an oppositional category. It is a positive category. While your money or your life is an oppositional category. Your money contra your life. And the great French psychoanalyst theoretician Jacques Lacan had a seminar on this. But again, that is also something we are not going to talk about. But we will talk about this book. This book, Jacques Lacan's book, is based upon exactly this problem, and hence I said the mistake of the translation is so interesting, because the mistake points to these two types of these two meanings: your money or your life and your money and your life. A contradictory category of money, where money is contra life and where money is not part of life. Money and life are together, kind of an accumulative logic of money and life, which is also a positive category. The book basically historically shows how in the 13th century, within Christianity, how in 13th century this transition happens, where earlier money was taken as something which is contradictory to life, more and more because of a certain crisis, because of a certain problem, historical problem, very specific to Christianity, Christian theology, that is, it transforms into a positive category. And the seeds of the positive category of money and life, in that sense, are the seeds are sown there, which much later with the evolution of capitalism, today we find a kind of a full frontal expression of something which is way back in the 13th century. We see the emergence of this problem. That doesn't mean that it is it can be directly linked. It is something which is it can be seen as a kind of a emergence, a certain emergence in history whose effects we are in a way feeling completely today, in a very brutal way today. So, so what is this problem? We will talk a bit about this problem of the emergence of money as a positive category. So you see, Jack Legoff talks about uh, mm, a particular practice, which is that of money lending in the 13th century. Money lending, usury. Usury was a practice which was much denounced within Christianity. Why was it much denounced, usury or money lending? Because okay, let me just give you a background of why is it that money lending suddenly becomes a historical problem. Because in the 12th century, within in Christianity, in the Western history, in medieval history, in 12th century, there is a certain proliferation of wealth and knowledge, which is taken as the medieval Renaissance. It is called the 12th century Renaissance, and this affects everything. This affects art. This affects religion itself. A kind of a reformation of Christianity happens within the theological doctrines are being revised at this time. It is a question of a renaissance which is happening within theology, but it is also happening materially or economically. So, lands which were left fallow for a long time are now being plowed because plow is invented at that time. So there is a certain that agrarian reforms are happening that time. This is all from these books, which Lagoff and other people, great French historians like Georges Duby, Jacques Lagoff. These are the people who, in a way, who propose this problem that this medieval time taken as dark ages. That's all not true. This is a very complex time where a lot of things are happening internal. One of the things that they talk about is this 12th century Renaissance, which everybody is very interested in. And it is during this time when there is a certain affluence, when there is a certain economic growth, that money lending becomes a problem. Again, money lending is also related to a certain relationship between Christians and Jews. So it's money lending is also something which is related to an anti-Semitism which is developing within Christianity. All of that I'm not going into. That is there in the book. You can read that book. But what is interesting is the very structure of money lending itself, or usury itself, which is, and let me read this because it's a bit technical thing. That which is what is the problem of money lending? The problem of money lending, from a religious Christian perspective, theological perspective, is that money lending. Okay, let me explain. Money lending is a way of making profit, which is for the Christians, from the Christian perspective, they said it is a making profit which is not natural. So if you lend a piece of land, an orchard, an apple orchard to somebody, and as return, as your profit of lending this, you gain, you receive the fruits which the apple orchard bears, the apples. Then that is a profit that is acceptable for Christianity, because that is something which nature itself produces. Fruit is itself a production of nature. So that is a profit that is acceptable because it is natural, because it is something which is, if God has created nature and nature creates apples, then it is in the domain of God. Okay? Because no, natural domain is also something which is created by God. So it is natural profit. But money lending is where you gain profit, that is, you gain money because of lending money, which itself is artificial. So it is seen as an unnatural nature of making profit. This is the first reason. The second reason is, again, it is unnatural because what is it that is being borrowed? No. If it is not a land or a natural property or a natural piece of anything that is created either by man or by God, even the creation of man, if you lend, say, a plow and you get some wealth, it is also man's own creation, and man's own creation is an imitation of God's own creation. So that is also allowed. But money lending is not allowed, because what is borrowed is not an object but time. What is borrowed is time. That is what they argue. That is how the theologians argue. That in money lending, what is borrowed is that you borrow time. That because it is over a period of time that you gain a certain interest which is being paid. So this becomes the problem. That time is the prerogative, is the domain of God. Only God can govern time. Only God, because God is basically the one who sees. God is, in that sense, atemporal. God is beyond time. God is not time, and yet God is the source of time. This is this is coming from, prior to it, from Aristotle, but it is something Christianity takes in a major way. God itself, yeah, and this is the source of a lot of debate within Christianity. Because anyway, I'm not going into that. But God is basically the one who can only give or take time. But who is God is the source of time. God is the one who can give you time, or you can take time away. Because if you say, for example, God decides, no, when somebody dies, so it takes time away from you. So that is the prerogative of God, or gives you more time. That is the prerogative of God. That cannot be the prerogative of man. So money lending is a problem, because money lending is basically seen as man taking over the function of God. Hence, it is something which is taken as a sin, because it so both of these leads to a condemnation of usury, of money lending, and so this is the first. Second thing is that so money lending is then related to something which is one of the cardinal sins. There are 7 cardinal sins: pride, sloth, gluttony. One of the cardinal sins was avarice, that is greed for wealth, not greed in itself, but greed for wealth. So greed for food is gluttony. Uh, Greed for wealth is taken as avarice. So money is a sin, which is avarice. And avarice, so you see, very interesting thing happens in the 13th century, that while money lending becomes such an important historical problem, avarice, Christianity fights back with this historical problem by making avarice the most important, or the most, you know, the central sin. As in, yeah, this should happen within the Christian history, that at times one sin among these 7 would become the primary sin. So sometimes lust would sometimes avarice at this time becomes the, so it replaces, I think, some other sin. I forgot exactly. So anyway, so this becomes a sin. So money basically is a sin. Why is it a sin? Because it is unnatural. It is not within the domain of God's creation. And what is it that is not in the domain of God's creation? What is not in the domain of God's creation is in the domain of the devil. So money is pure evil. Money is basically the domain of Satan. All of that. But you have to understand. So money then gives you a whole set of feelings which is not talked about today. So for example, money, this kind of an average. So money is talked about vis-a-vis, say, terror, because money gives you divine punishment. So money is talked about vis-a-vis, hopelessness. So these are the corresponding emotions that Christianity attached towards money: terror, hopelessness. So anyway, so this is the problem. This is the basic origin of the problem. But you have to understand two things here. One is that in Christianity, at this time, and this is a bit complicated, but you have to understand. So I'll take another 10-15 minutes and I'll wrap up. That, uh, that, so if money is, so life is part of God's creation. Uh, Money is then not part of God's creation. Money is something which is contrary to life. Hence, you have the emergence of your money or your life. So if you live a life which is determined by money and wealth and avarice, then you are basically substituting life for money, which ends you in hell, ends you in the domain of. So money is taken as a negative thing. Wealth is taken as a negative thing. Hence, this contradiction can happen, which is between money and between life. But what is the state of life within Christianity? This is also something which is very important. So life is also something which is not just one homogeneous thing. Life is also something which is so you understand. Again, let me just as a footnote reiterate this. So money and life are taken as two contradictory things. Money is negative, life is positive. But nevertheless, both money and life can be represented. They both have a symbolic value. So negativity also has a symbolic value. Positivity also has a symbolic value. This is very important. That money represents something which is not life, while life represents the affirmation of a something positive, which is creation of God's creation. Now, why is it that we are saying that both had a symbolic value? Both had a symbolic value because in Christianity is also this is a dualist. This is a kind of a what is called a Manichaean dualism. Christianity is based upon this dualism between money and life, uh, which is basically embodied by your money or your life. But Christianity is also based upon a question of hierarchy. So, for example, so basically, this life that we are talking about is also something which is not homogeneous. This life, which is God's creation, is hierarchy. So, you have theologically, okay, not just historically, theologically, it is hierarchy. That means that there is a cosmic hierarchy, that is in heaven there is hierarchy, God, then angels, then within angels hierarchy, and this cosmic hierarchy is reflected in the world in the feudal hierarchy between men. So there are clerics, there are nobles, and then there are peasants. I mean the common folk, the lay people. So this is the feudal arrangement of society, tripartite society. It's called tripartite society. But this hierarchic society is also something whose source is a kind of a divine hierarchy. So this whole idea of life is positively represented in a hierarchic fashion. So it is symbolic and as also it is hierarchic. Those who practice usury, those who are money lenders, are expelled from this hierarchic understanding of life. They are outside. That is, they are in hell. They are in the negative space. But interestingly, in the negative space, in the space of hell also, there is hierarchy. No? There, it is not simply a homogeneous space. Hell is not a negativity is not simply that which is not positive. Negativity, which is not positive, is also symbolically determined. No? That is that it has an it is objectively determined in that sense. It has an objectively determined or represented. So what is this representation? If you read Dante, for example, find this very clearly that the money lender. So Dante, in this gives you the 7 circles of hell. What are the 7 circles of hell, or 9 circles? Sorry, 9 circles. I think, yeah, 9 circles of hell are basically hierarchies. According to your sin, you will be placed at a specific circle. And within the circles, there are subdivisions. So it is highly categorized. There is a brilliant painting by Botticelli later on in the where you see these circles of hell pictorially, visually. So there are. It's also hierarchy. So hell is also the negative space is also hierarchy, and the person who commits usury, person who commits money lending, is placed at a more severe place than murderers, blasphemers, people who do blasphemy, people who do murders. Money lending is even a worse crime. So they are placed in a much deeper circle. I think they are placed in a 7th or 8th circle. I'm not referring to my notes exactly for that, but you understand the structure. Basically, it is also a question of hierarchy. Okay, so this is very important that it is dualistic, but at the same time it is symbolic, that it is hierarchy. Now, in this space, so money is condemned. The money is non-life from a Christian perspective. But then why a problem happens that then what happens? But this has to be solved. But money lending is a very prominent historical practice. So what do you do? Because people who were money lenders, they were not simply Jews, they were also Christians, and they wanted a way out. They wanted uh, how to get a way out of this problem where if you basically practice money lending, you are condemned, you are damned for life. Or there is a question of restitution of the wealth. So if you are the only way you can find your ticket to heaven, so to speak, is if you give all your wealth back that you have accumulated through money lending, usually. So this is called a restitution of wealth. But how can you have a restitution of wealth when the interests have been so varied all over your life, and it is almost not possible? So they have to come up. That was the only kind of penance which was possible for you to, have a possibility of entering heaven. But then how do you solve a problem like this? How do you solve? Because they wanted their tickets into heaven, into paradise. So a very intelligent, absolutely extraordinary thing was invented in the 13th century within theology. And this is what Jacques Lagoff, the historian, talks about in this book on Your Money or Your Life, but also talks about in a separate book in a much more detailed fashion, which is a place which is called, this is theology. This is from a theological perspective, a place called the purgatory. Purgatory. So there is a book called The Birth of Purgatory by Jacques Lagoff. I'll take 5-10 minutes and finish. So purgatory was taken as a place where purgatory is a waiting place. It's like a platform where you are waiting after you die. But the only thing about purgatory is not a waiting place where this is something which people get confused. Purgatory is not where, no, purgatory is a waiting place between heaven and hell. Okay? And what you do in the earth, that is your relatives, your no, your friends, they have to basically offer sacrifices, or they have to offer sacrifices, they have to do penance for you to go to heaven. So your basically penance can give you a ticket to heaven. Here depends upon that. So there is an economy of penance, economy of penitentiary practices, which lands you in heaven if you are in purgatory. But the interesting part of it is that if you get a ticket to purgatory, you are ending up in heaven. You will not go to hell. So it is not, purgatory is not a place where you can go either to hell or to heaven. You go only to heaven. This is very important. Okay, this is the beauty of this invention, purgatory. That purgatory is a waiting place with one. Jacques Legoff says purgatory is a waiting place with just one door, and that door leads to heaven, to life, to eternal life in that sense. And so you see, purgatory is a place. So if you can do all, you can be a money lender and you have a life of, a life which is devoted to money and wealth, but you can go to purgatory if you before dying, if you repent, you can go to purgatory. You cannot just verbally repent and go to heaven. If you verbally repent before, then if you verbally repent, that amounted to nothing. You have to do restitution, that is physically return the wealth. But now with 13th century, you have a new practice that before dying, if you verbally repent, then you end up in purgatory. And then if you do a set of, I'm schematizing this, is a much more complicated practice. But if you basically, do a certain economy of penance, you end up in heaven. You see what is happening structurally. And this is the most interesting part, and I'll probably finish with this. The purgatory is a place where a life which is not life, which is a life of wealth, is transformed into life. Or the problem of non-life, or the problem of wealth as the condemnation, the wealth as non-life, or wealth or money as the absence of life, is what is called circumvented. Purgatory is a place of positivization. Purgatory is a place where the negativity of money is positivized into life. Understand? So, continuously, the negativity which money generates, that is the non-life, the kind of dangers that life with money has, hence money or your life, is now converted or transformed. Converted, transform is perhaps not the best word to describe. The best word perhaps is to circumvent. To circumvent the problem of money as non-life into the positive idea of life. So purgatory is a place of positivization. Purgatory is a place where the negative is in a way circumvented to reach the positive. The negative is made into a positive. This is the main argument, of the book. Hence, purgatory is a place from where you have a new argument, which is not simply a question of your money or your life, but your money and your life. You can have both now. You can have both money and life. That is divine life, or eternal life, or paradise. Purgatory gives you that space. It seems to me that today's problem is very similar in the sense, and I'll just end with this proposition, that today the kind of alienation, the kind of negativity that money generated, the kind of alienated life, kind of all the problems that you would see in narratives in 19th century, early 20th century narratives vis-a-vis money, kind of alienation that money proposes. I can develop. I don't have the time, but you can develop this. Uh, that alienation, that kind of a negativity today, that a life of wealth inherently produces. Anyway, we all, sometimes we say this in a commonsensical phrase. Yes, they are rich, but they are not happy, which is inherently there. And Marx shows this, and a lot of thinkers have shown that inherently it produces a life of alienation, a life of lack of meaning, lack of symbolization. This lack of symbolization, this lack of meaning is now, in a way, not solved, but more and more being circumvented into a kind of a display, or a kind of a positive display, which is a kind of it is made into a spectacle, so that this lack or this alienation is something which is dissimulated, which is in a way erased. Not just dissimulated, it is something we cannot, should not talk about, but rather talk about the positive, the hyper positive, effects of a life of wealth, a life of happiness, a life of, which affects almost everything. So this is also a question of positivization, a question of erasing the negative, or finding a way how you can move away from the negative into a question of hyper positivity. So I would suggest something like this kind of a proposition, that it is not the hell of alienation in which we live today, but something like a purgatorial, a kind of a new purgatory, where the continuous generation of negativity or nihilism within our society is being continually transformed, or appears to be transformed into something which is put on display, which is the question of a kind of a positive life. Hence, today there is an overarching presence of life as money, and money as life, which cannot be extricated from each other, which cannot be separated from each other, which has become both the passion and the great entertainment of our generation. This is basically what I. This can be developed further in a much more nuanced way, but I don't think we have the time. So, yeah, thank you. So if you have any questions, please do ask.
Thank you. Thank you so much, sir. On behalf of TG, we are grateful to you, and thank you so much for your insightful lecture. Thank you so much, sir.
No, no, thank you. Thank you.